have I actually thought through what they're reading and said, it's fine?
Yes.
It could be a valid option.
Mm-hmm.
Or am I pushing the easy button and saying, I don't believe in an ideal, therefore it's fine? Because those are two very different things.
Yes.
I'm not going to say that I'm fit to judge every children's book for every person who's listening to this show.
Absolutely.
But the question is more, did you attempt to make a just judgment? Or did you push the modern easy button and say, in this action, I declare there is no ideal?
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling, who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can come study Charlotte Mason with me over in the Charlotte Mason Think Tank. Go to afterthoughtsblog.net/think tank to learn more. My co-hosts today are Misty Winkler and Abby Wall. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 1 graduate. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, now available on Amazon. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé Sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Have you joined the Scholé Sistership yet? We just began our newest Sophie Seminar, TechTonic. Together, we are reading our way around the screen time issue. We had our first live session on Monday, and it went great. The goal of this seminar is for us all to be better equipped to make just judgments about this issue. After all, informed opinions are the only opinions worth having. It's not too late to join the seminar. All you have to do is head on over to scholésisters.com/join and sign up for the Sophie plan. Today's episode is our annual retreat episode, meaning we recorded it when we were together in Dallas. As is typical, the sound quality is questionable, but the content is great, if we do say so ourselves. We discussed the existence of the ideal type using David Hicks' authoritative book, Norms and Nobility. We think you'll love this conversation. And so, without further ado, let's get to it.
All right, let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
Hello, this is Misty, and my Scholé Everyday today is the book I'm reading next for my Well-Educated Mind book group. Our theme this year will be, or is, autobiographies, and the Well-Trained Mind has 27 autobiographies listed. So we went through and picked the autobiographies that are conversion stories. So we read Augustine's Confessions, and the last book we read was The Life of St. Teresa of Avila, as written by herself. And then our next one is a book I didn't know existed, and it's called Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners by John Bunyan.
So cool.
Yes, so I'm very, very excited. And this edition that we're reading is not updated. And I generally read updated Pilgrim's Progresses. But it's also short, so I think we can make it. But yes, I'm kind of surprised it's short because Bunyan can sometimes be kind of wordy.
A little bit.
So,
Yes.
but I'm excited to read that one.
So fun.
This is Abby, and Brandy recommended this, I think, in a Scholé Everyday portion of our episode, and it is called Natural Born Heroes. And I am enjoying it so much. One of the things that I love to read is books on health and wellness, and especially athletes and endurance kinds of things. And so this book is perfectly suited. But one of the great quotes is pretty early on in the book, and it says that the ancient Greeks knew this. Their entire culture was built on the premise that everyone is tinged with a touch of the godly. To be a hero, you had to learn how to think, run, fight, and talk, even eat, sleep, and crawl like a hero. And I loved this because reading through Paideia by Werner Jaeger, which I only have a couple chapters left, by the way. I just love this idea of this hero or this heroic ideal, which goes today with today's discussion, but this ideal and these heroes and this idea of arete and this idea of this enculturation and how that was transmitted. And he goes and talks about this in this chapter about how these everyday, ordinary people did extraordinary things because it was part of their upbringing and their culture. So I'm just really enjoying this book.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I was telling Abby that one of the guys featured in this book is a guy named, I think you say it, George Psychoundakis, I think is how you say it. Greek guy, go figure. Anyway, he wrote another book called The Cretan Runner. So my daughter just got that book to read it because she was so fascinated by his story in this book. So I'll have to tell you what she thinks of it when she's further in. She's just barely opened the first page. So this is Brandy. And mine is a 5x5 challenge book that I have been reading for a long time. I had to put down this summer. And so I finally just finished it. I'm going to butcher the name again because it's a French word.
Bichon.
I really should,
Bichon.
But that's not how they say it.
Bichon?
It's like Bechamp or something. Or Pasteur, A Lost Chapter in the History of Biology by Ethel Hume. And actually my copy has another book in the front of it, which is called Pasteur, Plagiarist, Imposter. Tell me how you really feel. So this book has been fascinating because at my chiropractor's office, she has, what is it called? The Real Dr. Fauci book that Bobby Kennedy wrote. And so when I'm there, I call it the library room. It's really not a library, but she has a bunch of books there and I'll grab them. So I've just been slowly reading through the book because I'll read like 4 pages while I'm waiting for her or whatever. The similarity to me between Pasteur and Fauci is striking. Like from the abuse of animals to the lies to the manipulation of data to, I know, sorry. I was like, what is she doing?
This is not a controversial episode.
It's not.
We can't ever stop her.
Fascinating.
Nope.
It's fascinating. You can't stop me. I'm sorry. No, but it really is fascinating. So he had a relationship with Napoleon and everyone was afraid of him. And so he would use his political power and his charm. He was apparently very charming. And he would use that to intimidate his opposition. So when he couldn't steal his data from someone, he just would kind of shame people into really just believing whatever it was that he said or what. It was really fascinating, especially because as part of AO, Ambleside Online, we read Microbe Hunters, and it has a lot of this history, but the chapter on Pasteur is very, it's, when you read it, if you read it with open eyes at all, you cannot help but feel this is a very romanticized version of anybody because it's just 100% hero worship, right? And I am sure that he did some good things because I don't think people are all one or all the other. But this book starts out by criticizing the portrayal of him in Microbe Hunters.
Oh, fun.
And so it was fun because I was like, so I'm getting the other side. Like, I like to get the other side of the story. So this gal obviously has a very romanticized take on the guy whose name I can't pronounce. Antoine Béchamp, I think is how you say it. But it is very fascinating. And I think one of the things she's really getting at is, what does it mean to have the heart of a true scientist? And so she talks about how, like, he was not self-promoting. He was not obsessed with money, power, fame. And so because of that, sometimes he did himself a real disservice, which is, I think, a common tale. But in the end, she talks about his pursuit of truth. And like I said, I really do think that she probably has romanticized him. That's my guess, that it's just like reading Microbe Hunters, but the opposite story. Mm. But she says in the end, truth, not self, was Béchamp's lodestar. I really did love that. So the whole first part of it really is more about like fermentation, the discovery of microbes and that kind of stuff. And it's not until the very end that she gets into inoculation. But it I actually got this book that I had read as a child that was another romanticized version of Louis Pasteur. I grabbed it and I was like, this was a lie. My childhood was telling me lies. Because one of the famous stories is the story of how he saves this child from rabies. And it was very interesting, the full story of that, because the child had already been treated with cauterization. I think it was using carbolic acid. I could be wrong about that. Well, that had an almost 100% success rate. So he was saying, so he didn't isolate the variable, right? The child had already, so then that was touted as a success. So 2 other things about that. No one proved the dog was rabid. The dog also bit his owner, who never had his wounds treated and never was inoculated and never got sick. Mm-hmm. So then they said this was a great success. So then 2 other parents, when their children were mauled by dogs, invited him to come. And both of those children died probably from the inoculation, which is par for the course because he would inoculate whole herds of cattle and 80 to 90% of them would die. So anyway, it's interesting to read the parts we're not told. There's a lot. I mean, you have to be interested in, I think, the history of science because it really gets into the weeds, like the old language for things and what they were calling things that it was to the point where I got confused sometimes. Was he talking about a bacteria? Is he talking about the microbiome? And then at one point he said something and I'm like, did he discover stem cells? Like, I can't tell because they're using these weird words and I'm not sure that he even knew really what he was talking about. But it was interesting to see like where we've come from and how we got here. So the book was written. So it looks like it was first published in 1923. So they had just had the flu epidemic, that kind of thing. Anyway, so it was really interesting to hear someone writing about the dangers of big pharma. And it was almost exactly 100 years ago. And it's easy to feel like all these things are new. Mm-hmm. But it turns out the ancient desire for money, power, fame, or some combination.
There's nothing new under the sun.
Turns out Ecclesiastes was right. So I think that to me was the most fascinating thing is to think it's not a new struggle. It's an old struggle. And it's always going to be this way. And we just have to watch for it and know that people will get rich off of illness like they try to get rich off of everything. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's an interesting book. Recommended for people who want to geek out on history, biology.
Yeah, and yours is a geek out on Pilgrim's Progress fans, fanboy or fangirls and boys, and mine is if you want to do athletic feats.
I will say, Natural Born Heroes, though, the whole history of World War II that's in there, yes, I've never heard that story. Mm. So that, all on its own right, I'm like, I had no idea Hitler had people on Crete, and I mean, it was crazy. So,
and they were totally sabotaged by just a few shepherds.
That's so awesome.
I was talking with a friend about that. That reminds me of the Revolutionary War, too. You just have these really unsophisticated colonists that end up beating the world's most powerful, at the time, army. Mm-hmm. But I think those kinds of things also serve as a warning to us, because supposedly we have the world's most powerful army. And I think in both cases, you do have a situation where people got prideful and rested in their own strength and thought, well, these little peasants could never hurt us. And that's the beginning of the downfall of your empire. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Abby here to tell you about the Sistership. Do you ever feel frustrated with social media? Scroll looking for good ideas, like beautiful pictures, and follow accounts that portray an ideal? But when you walk away, you feel distracted, dissatisfied, and disappointed with the time that you've wasted? Because what you're really looking for is connection and having real conversations about what matters most to homeschooling moms, about educational philosophy and principles, not just superficial and shallow tips and tricks. Well, the Sistership is a place for moms to dig deep into principles and practices, not to waste time. We want to help you connect and find community, not just online, but in real life. The Sistership is private, ad-free, drama-free, and free to join. Find your like-minded sisters today. Go to scholésisters.com/sistership.
Today we are going to talk about the ideal type, and we read page 38. That's what I wrote down.
Chapter 4.
Norms and Nobility, and then chapter 4.
I didn't read page 38.
Oh, how could you?
But I did read chapter 4.
It's fine. I actually was like, I don't think we really need to bring page 38 into this, but
Now I'm looking.
it was basically the idea that they were trying to raise adults. I mean, it does play into the talk of the ideal type in the sense that perhaps some of the resistance is that we don't want to measure a child against a man. But they weren't measuring the child against a man so much as they were raising him to be a man.
Right.
But I could see how that gets sticky, especially for we moms. And we have these little precious children, you know, and we're like, we don't want to think about them becoming men and like warrior heroes or whatever. Right.
But he did in chapter 4, he did talk about the difference between an immature and a mature mind. Right. And that's what that guiding was. So maybe that's the other way to think about it.
So let's back up and talk about what is the ideal type, or is there only one? And define it, because not everybody has norms and nobility. So did I say norms and nobility, or did I just say we read page 38 and chapter 4?
I think.
Of Norms and Nobility.
By David Hicks.
By David Hicks. So now that I've completely botched the intro.
This is why we have outlines,
Right.
Brandy.
Right. I know. I sort of have an outline. I have all my notes in my hand right here. So anyway, you're our definitions girl. Why don't we just let you?
Oh, but I didn't prepare one.
Well then, it's a free-for-all.
Well, we can give the Sunday school answer.
Yes.
Jesus.
Yeah, well, just shortcut it.
Yeah.
So the ideal type in what Hicks is talking about here is having a telos for what we're aiming for. But what's a standard ideal? So we're not talking about even standard, maybe realistic, achievable. We're used to, I think it's modern Americans setting achievable, realistic, measurable goals.
Mm-hmm.
And the ideal type is not that. The ideal type is, what does complete and total excellence look like? And that's the direction we're heading.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not even like you expect to get there, but you know what choices to make because you know what you're aiming at. And you're aiming at something where there's always more and better ahead of you.
There is no arrival point.
There's no arrival.
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe once we die.
Right. So I think I have a question written on my chapter that I think is from the first time I read this chapter. And it says, so is classical education perfectionist?
That's funny because that's kind of, I think I asked it a little bit differently. Let me find it. Yeah. How does belief in the ideal type not cause us to run headlong into perfectionism?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and how does it become that our children can never please us if we're teaching in this way? Because it does seem like that's a danger. I mean, yes, I may be saying that it's Jesus is helpful in a practical sense of no one actually expects their child to become Jesus. We know that that's unachievable.
And yet we are in scripture told to imitate Christ and to be Christ-like.
Yeah.
And so it's like the ancient educators knew that there was, or would be, a perfect man that we were supposed to be imaging and we're supposed to be maturing into. They didn't know who it was yet.
Right.
But in a way, I think it's one way the Western world was prepared for the gospel. They already have this concept. And then the gospel comes in and says, yeah, that ideal that you were seeking, you are supposed to be seeking it. It's Christ.
Yes. That's interesting.
And in the ancients, they would have gone to the myths and Homer and all of these demigods, right, where they were to do heroic acts. And one of the parts of this is also seeing where they fail to meet those ideals and then being able to talk about that and notice that where they succeeded and where they failed and how they are pursuing and getting closer to that excellence.
on page 45, he talks about the ideal type being a composite image.
Yes.
Where it's put together from many parts. It's not like they had a single ideal character. It's not like they thought Odysseus was the ideal type or whatever. That each of their heroes embodied some particular part of excellence.
Yes.
And that's the part that you are supposed to imitate.
Yep.
Which I think is also helpful because while I agree that Christ is the ideal type, there's a lot of things we don't know about him too. Like when you're starting to talk about the whole person, body, mind, and soul, he obviously seems well educated when he's well spoken, and we don't know anything about like his physical life. We have to assume that he embodied excellence in all areas.
I mean, he could walk.
And he could walk. That's true.
A long way.
That's true. So endurance.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm not being creative enough in how I think about him to discover that. But I'm thinking about, he talks about teaching from examples, and we do have Paul saying, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And I'm thinking, well, with Paul, there's a lot we don't know about Paul, but he talks about buffeting his body and making it his slave. And so you get this sense of physical endurance. I don't know, maybe part of it actually is that for us, a physical ideal gets mixed up with modern conceptions of what that really means. They were seeing the body as serviceable. We see the body as
aesthetically pleasing.
Exactly. You want it to be something that people want to look at, which is a totally different goal, really.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, sometimes making it in such a way that people want to look at it makes it less serviceable.
Mm-hmm.
So on page 45, I also had underlined something on page 45 because I felt like he simplified the epitome of the ideal type in one sentence, which was nice. He talked about kallikagathia, which was like a Greek word. And he says, a man both beautiful and good.
Yes.
And I just thought, okay, I can wrap my mind around that. I mean, there's a lot to fill in, but it was simple and it made sense to me.
Well, and the other part that I found is it's transcendent, right? It is something that never goes out of style. Even if all the culture is giving you different, elevating different types of heroes, there is still this ideal type that transcends those things. And it's oftentimes is counter to what is popular, but when you recognize it, because there is just something so different about it.
Well, to talk about just the beautiful part, there's all that research about that really, what we universally in all cultures find beautiful is someone whose face exists in just proportion, right? Like it's perfectly symmetrical. And if you put up a mirror, it reflects basically the same on both sides. And a lot of us are not like that. I'm sure certainly not like that. But they talk about, taking those things and even measuring how babies in different cultures respond to them. And it's universally positive. It doesn't matter about skin color or height or any of those other things. It all falls away when you talk about proportion, which is fascinating, points to the idea that there is something objective that's transcending all the makeup and all the working out and all that. Like at the end of the day, some people were born that way. And they are truly more beautiful. Like they're closer to the ideal, right? Than the rest of us.
That golden mean is what it says on page, 46, 47 or something like that. But there is that golden mean that they're talking about. Yeah. So the Greek doctrine of golden mean prescribed man as he ought to be, physically poised, mentally balanced and rounded off, thoughtful in action and active in thought. The living embodiment of the ideal type. And here he goes on to say, the modern man, on the other hand, defines on the other hand, defines the individual as he is in relation to a statistical point.
Yep. And that's where you get perfectionism, actually, because if it's a measured single point, that's just in relation to other people. Like you're taking a survey and finding out what's normal and trying to reach that. And you're thinking that you can achieve it and then have that status moving forward, which is, I think, the difference between perfectionism and the ideal type is that perfectionism thinks that you're going to get there. Like you're not happy until you get what you're working for. And this concept of the ideal type is more of a direction you're heading. And you're making choices in line with that goal. So you're happy every time you make the right choice which is going to fit in very nicely with the retreat that we're at.
Yes.
True.
But it's about your continued action. It's not something that you are inherently, and then from that status that you've achieved, from there you go on in perfection and completeness. It's more about recognizing that every choice you make matters.
Mm.
So I have a family member, and they trained for an Ironman. And, you know, she spent a long time, got trainers, did everything, completed that Ironman, thought she had arrived. And then she talked about like the disappointment of like, yes, she was happy that she finished it and everything like that and did well. But once you reach this thing that you think is your ideal, your goal, and then you're like, but there's not, what do I do next? And you having to do that. And when you don't have, and I mean, that's an incredible feat that most people will never do,
Right,
like
yeah.
2% of the population, maybe, if that. So I remember her talking about this and saying like, I need to come up with something that isn't
achievable.
And how interesting that was to me to just hear that. So,
Yeah.
and you're like, Iron Man, come on.
So that makes you think about how they say that about Olympians, you know, like famous athletes that have reached like Super Bowl championship or whatever. Yeah. Like there's nowhere to go when you're the top in your field. I mean, I wonder though, if it comes back to, we want a man both beautiful and good. And so maybe you've achieved the beautiful side, right? The physical side of it. Maybe the unachievable is actually the good side, because can you really overexcel in virtue? Can you ever be the top in your field in virtue? I mean, it seems less achievable to me than the physical side, even though I will never do an Ironman, and we all know that.
Well, and that Ironman achievement is also not something you keep unless you keep.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
But isn't virtue like that? Because I feel like that's actually something that I was planning on saying in the retreat, is this idea that, you know, we could take a virtue that's a habit, like telling the truth. And you could do that 30 years, 40 years. You can make one choice to tell a lie, which makes it easier to tell the next lie, easier to tell the next lie. And you can, in midlife or in old age, become a liar. Virtue is not permanent either.
Right.
And we can't ever just rest on our laurels. And that's interesting, because that's actually a sports saying,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I never thought
of that. Yeah, right.
Resting on your achievements that you've already, your past performance.
You got the crown.
I actually think that one of the points that we've been trying to drive home in the retreat about choice being integral to the habit process ties into this perfectly, because it rests on choice, then that actually shows you that it's somewhat temporary, you know, or that it can be lost and not just gained.
Yes.
Because just like you can make a good choice, you can make a bad one, which we all do.
Yep.
So here we have this, and you kind of touched on this when you talked about measuring to the statistical point. But as a culture, I mean, really, one of the biggest things where we, as classical teachers, diverge from the modern world is that the modern world has completely dispensed with the ideal type. I think for a long time it dispensed with good but kept beautiful. But I think now we could say we're also dispensing with beautiful. I mean, really, like
100%.
The ugliness movement is a really interesting thing. I don't want to like get off track, but I do think it's connected to this, that when you start to reject the ideal, eventually you reject the whole ideal. So in the 1950s, everybody looked really nice, and people will sometimes even look with longing at those pictures because the women were so well dressed and everybody was fit and trim and all this and that. But it's like, actually, they had dispensed with good at that point, not on an individual level, but like culturally in the classroom, there was no ideal type. We were already measuring to a statistical point. So,
well, and now you've gotten to a point. So he talks a lot about the judgment part of it, right? Judging whether things are good and true and things like that. And now we're called not to judge. You get in big trouble if you're being really judgmental, right? You have to accept, support, embrace. What's the other one? Just like
affirm.
Yeah, affirm. There we go.
Yeah.
That was the word. And not allowed to make judgments. Whereas a classical education, we are judging these ideas, these ideals, and saying, like, I think of Plutarch, and he mentions this in this chapter as well, but how he talks about these different lives, and he talks about the good and the bad, and how you have to defend one of these, like Alcibiades, and how he was quite a bit of a scoundrel and treacherous, but he also was a great leader in certain parts. Like there's these different things.
That is a judgment.
Judgments, and how we've totally dispensed with judgment, or you're only getting judgment if you don't affirm, support, embrace everything as equally good and acceptable.
Yeah.
The way you said that just struck me, because we think of, like, what we're talking about would be characterized as being judgy. And so it's like all judgment is judgy. But something about the sentence there with judgment is the word also just means discernment.
Yes.
Right.
You know, if you dispense with judgment, you are dispensing with your ability to make good decisions, period.
When we talk about what do we want in a graduate from our homeschools, let's say, we don't want non-judgmental. Actually, there's no such thing as being non-judgmental. People are, it's just it's made up.
Yes.
So what we're looking for is just judgment. Are they able to judge well? I mean, that's what we want. A just man is able to judge well, and that's what we want. That is a virtue. I mean, honestly, the reason why my book review will make some people uncomfortable is because I claimed to make a judgment, and I may be wrong. I need to do more reading. I haven't finished my real Dr. Fauci. I think I make people uncomfortable sometimes because I don't buy into the idea that we should be trying to judge well. And that means risking making a bad judgment and having to come back later and say, it's safe to not make a judgment. Because then I don't have to ever apologize for having made a bad decision.
I don't ever have to be wrong.
Yeah.
Yes. And he talked about that as well in the example of courage, that sometimes we need to have a person who participates in courageous action and sometimes fail at that.
Yeah.
Because failing, and it's not that we want to set up the kids to fail at courage, but that they can come back from that too. It was on the 40, it was earlier in the chapter. That's right. Failure of meeting the ideal, however regrettable, deepens the understanding of courage and why it is fundamental to human life.
Well, it's like I tell my kids when they're upset about, not doing well on something. And it's like, what did you expect to be the best the first time?
Right.
Like, you're just getting started.
Yeah. Yeah. Some kids do. And it's
a part of perfectionism is not wanting to get started or do anything you can't be perfect at. And so this is another way in which the ideal type is not perfectionism, because you're not expecting it to be instant or achievable right off the bat. You are trying, and you will fail, and you learn through the failures.
What's interesting is by avoiding the failures, we're actually also avoiding developing perseverance.
Or almost any virtue.
Or that's true. Almost any virtue. That is true, actually. That virtue is often developed through the difficult things. So for externally, like obstacles in life, but also internally, because it's hard for me. So he talks about different ways to teach the ideal type. And I did want us to talk about that. But one of the things is I wanted to talk about what it's actually doing. You're teaching the ideal type in a certain way for a specific reason. So in chapter 4 is divided into parts. So in chapter 4, part 2, he talks about 2 problems with teaching the ideal type, because he says it could be boring. Because if people think that it's memorizing lists of things, lists of virtues, definitions of virtues, that real quickly loses our interest for a reason, because it's boring. And that boring is bad, because we shouldn't see virtue as boring. There's something really messed up with that. But the second thing he says is that it's difficult to teach, or a problem with teaching, because it falls into the sphere of action. How do you teach something that you have to actually do? That's where he talked about your cowardice.
Yes. It demands action. It is dynamic and imperative. It requires something of me.
So then he talks about using examples to teach. And that's one of his big things that he keeps coming back to, is that it's our history tales and our mythology and all of our stories, like we're actually teaching the ideal type through those kinds of things, which I think is interesting when we think about modern education in its latest iteration, is to completely attack everything that is holy. So we're going to tear down every founding father, every person, anybody who ever had a flaw, which is all of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
We're just going to rip them up. We're going to focus on the bad parts and talk about how terrible people were. So we're going to make judgments while saying that judgments are bad. And we're going to judge everybody for their worst sins and not recognize any virtue. I mean, it's a really fascinating thing how far we have come. But when he talks about, because he's not whitewashing history, he's talking about, you have to read, like, you don't want them to practice being cowards in order to understand cowardice. So you have to read an example of cowardice. But I thought it was fascinating when he said that by doing that, ancient literature commits a dialectical attack on non-essential characteristics that are attaching themselves to the ideal. So I was thinking about how with beauty, our conception of beauty is so mixed up. Our conception of a physical ideal is so mixed up because we don't think of the body as being something that needs to be fit for service. And so he's talking about a way to tease out the essential from the non-essential. Yes. The other interesting thing about that is that it's an admission that it's all mixed up, that even our stories aren't of perfect people doing perfect things.
So are you saying you're going to have to exercise judgment while reading stories?
Turns out.
Like you would be practicing. Making judgments also with the stories and not just with being judgy with the people around you, but with what you're reading, and learn to discern the good and the bad and the true and the beautiful. That's mixed up in all of us.
He talked about using devil's advocate to help teasing out. I'm like, oh, so every junior high boy would just love this.
Yes. And my dad.
But I thought that was interesting. Playing devil's advocate allows you, and he wanted you to try to defend the villain, right? Really, like try to defend it. And how do you do that? You're teasing out the non-essentials, really, in the process of doing that. The things that cause confusion are being, I think, more easily dealt with in this process than the things that we do. Because we go straight to almost sweeping things under the rug. Like we don't want to deal with those things that cause confusion or make us uncomfortable. So we just kind of get rid of it, or we stereotype it and attack it. This is dealing with it in a very realistic, hands-on sort of way.
Well, and he says about that they learned the ideal type through the mythology and the history, but that it's not because the mythology is prescriptive. Like they aren't getting the dogmatic, instructional, didactic understanding. They're getting examples and embodiments, so that this ideal type requires both mythos and logos, he says on page 44. The ideal type, like the word, capitalized, unites the warring mythos and logos. Poetry and philosophy both seek to explain the condition of human life through some formal idealization of experience. And it prescribes as it describes.
Yeah. Wendy Capehart's episode on heroes, right? Reading about heroes when they're younger, we are steeped in stories and we are steeped in those ideals and things like that. And as we grow older, we get to do more of the darker parts, right? Because that is part of those human flaws, but we don't want to erase the heroes at first, right? Isn't that the name of the episode is,
Heroes First.
Heroes First. Yeah. Right. We start with the ideal. And then as children get older, they already automatically recognize that things are not just, right? That's not fair. That's not right. And they start making those judgments because they do understand that there are these heroes. But as we get older, we can look at the darker sides of founding fathers or these heroes throughout the ages. And it will naturally move into that.
Some of his examples of teaching this and then comparing that to how our modern schools teach it, how even private schools sometimes teach it, about how sometimes we're tempted to teach it in our own homeschools. I really think it gives pause to, have I actually adopted the modern secular approach? Have I actually, in how I'm doing this, dispensed with the ideal type? We did that Heroes First episode because we were encountering so many people who objected to teaching Heroes First. They wanted
to having good biographies of Louis Pasteur.
Yeah, which I read first, right?
Yep.
And I read as a child, even. And the reason why I was so disappointed in him is because he did not live up to the ideal. It was actually that, right? That's why I wanted him to be who I thought he was, which is something we all have to deal with, right? Our heroes are human.
Yeah. So that disappointment perhaps is what, well, I think you don't want to teach your children falsehood is part of what you're trying to avoid.
And I would say that childhood book I had was false. I don't recall Micropunters actually romanticizing the story of the boy with measles. I actually don't remember that. Okay, but was it false? Or was it just not the whole story? I'm not sure. Because he really did give that boy a shot. And the little boy really did survive his dog bites. And really, that's what they told me. Was that not true? Or was it just not the whole story? Do I really think I should write a children's book that talks about how Pasteur is bad? Or something? I actually don't think that. Right.
Well, and you might be trying to protect your children from disappointment, where it sounds like what you're saying is that going through that process of being disappointed in someone not living up to the ideal they could have been or should have been is even a part of the education process. So you need heroes first and you need full history from multiple points of view later.
The other thing he talks about is this idea of a moral preoccupation, right? That we are to use everything, all of our studies, to produce a man or woman whose life conforms to the ideal in every detail. And education has its supremely moral aim. And I was thinking about this in regards to twaddle and books that, maybe our kids... we're like, well, it's fine. They'll grow out of that phase or whatever and things like that. But if we are concerned about these things, guarding against shows and things like that. And that's a lot because
things that are forming the students' tastes and desires.
Yeah. And does it have, is there morals in this, or at least can we talk about these things, in this, because not just checking out and well, it's fine. They're occupied and things like that. So
one of the things I wrote at the very end of when I was taking my notes, I was trying to contrast the classical approach of the embrace of the ideal with the modern approach of the rejection of the ideal. And I put, ultimately, it's hard on students. It's hard on parents. It's hard. The classical ideal is hard on everybody because it's very demanding.
Yes.
And the modern approach is the easy button and it feels safe. All I could think when you were saying about the twaddle is, have I actually thought through what they're reading and said, actually, it's fine?
Yes.
I think it could be a valid option. Or am I pushing the easy button and saying, I don't believe in an ideal, therefore it's fine? Because those are two very different things.
Yes.
I'm not going to say that I'm fit to judge every children's book for every person who's listening to this show.
Absolutely.
But the question is more, did you attempt to make a just judgment? Or did you push the modern easy button and say, in this action, I declare there is no ideal. Therefore, it doesn't matter. For me, just reading this, I was like, we have been so steeped in this that the first time I read this, I didn't even envision all of the ramifications. It took many more years of trying to live according to a classical ideal in my education to even see some of the things in this chapter that I saw this time. So part 3, he directly addresses why modern schools abandoned the ideal type. He says it is, on page 47, it's the falsifying influences of the social sciences upon the study of man. And he basically says rejection of the ideal type is victory of relativism and scientific realism.
Yep. And it's also, if you don't believe in your own fallenness, you can't believe in an ideal, right?
Interesting.
Right. Because
an ideal is transcendent. And so if there is no transcendent also.
Yeah. And it's all about, we can seek our own best life now.
Right.
And our own standards, but it is always for ourselves, to better ourselves. And it's selfish ambition and vain conceit, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is not the ideal.
No.
Well, and it's hard sometimes with these words that have kind of a lot of weight or connotation and meaning behind them when they're also similar to other words like realism.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, there's realism in art. And then I say realistic all the time. And so it seems like if I say realism, I'm talking about being realistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think sometimes that's the way it's portrayed. But realism is actually the opposite of idealism.
Yeah.
And actually, neither of those should be isms.
Mm-hmm.
The ideal type isn't idealism.
Yes.
That's a good point.
It's knowing that an ideal type exists and striving for it. It's not making...
well, he says you can't do it by a method or a skill, right? The truths of the ideal type result from insights that can be encouraged through imitation of language and myth, but not taught as a method or recipe, or in our vernacular, an algorithm, right?
Right. Yeah.
X plus Y equals this.
Formula.
When I was in grade school, I was always taught that a noun was a person, place, or thing.
Now it's that changed.
But it is an idea. That's that materialism, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And the first time I encountered that it was an idea was in Susan Weisbauer first language lessons when going through the parts of
reaching back to old school grammar instruction.
Yes, and so that I just thinking through that, I was like, that is why our public schools are all materialist, even in the very basics. Yes,
because they don't actually believe love is a noun, which is an interesting thing. Not according to their definition. I don't know what they think it is, but with the scientific realism, if we just substitute materialism for realism, it helps.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because he got into this idea of measuring only according to things that you can actually physically measure, like sensory information. And that gets to the whole thing that one of you brought up, which was the relation to a statistical point.
Yes.
Like that's materialism. You can't believe in an ideal if you don't believe in ideas. If you believe that only what you see, hear, taken through your senses is real, then the ideal's not real. So what did he say? It manifests on occasion in a person for a moment, not for his whole life. And so you can't measure that. You can't even capture that and study it. You can't put it in a laboratory and study it because it's fleeting for all of us.
For all humans. And if man is the measure of all things, then you can't have an ideal type.
Interesting.
But, I mean, Jesus was also a man. So it has existed in human form and does in heaven still.
And he's the one man you can't capture and study, though.
True.
If death can't keep him, surely some scientist in the lab cannot either. I do think we should talk about the victory of relativism. So we talked a little bit about the victory of
Descartes.
Yes. Well, and then also Rousseau, right?
Yes.
Wasn't it Rousseau?
Yes. Well, what you were just talking about is the skepticism.
Yeah.
And I can't believe anything until it's been proven to me. And that's the Descartes.
Yes.
To say that there is a truth and I can know it, is a controversial statement at this point in society, which is ridiculous. What about Rousseau?
Well, so Rousseau, this is not an exact quote because I wrote notes here. He said something along the lines of, if men are born good, then surely one man's personal ideal is as good as another's. That's relativism. Which I was thinking, it's the book of Judges, right? Every man does what is right in his own eyes.
That turned out so well.
It really turned out great. So Rousseau, he tied the ideal to... It's a French phrase that I'm going to botch again. I really should talk to someone who speaks French before we do these episodes. But l'ancien régime, which looks like to me the ancient regime.
Oh, yeah. I just say ancient regime in my mind.
Good. It looks just like it, so I'm hoping we're right. It says he muddied... I said this after reading it. He muddied the waters with the non-essentials.
Yes.
Like, that's really what's going on, is it's now all mixed up. So that's why I think people have trouble completely rejecting Rousseau, because they see some good benefits out of it. But the result was that there was no need to correct or convert. And so, just to make Abby uncomfortable and make another judgment, I will say that is what is wrong with unschooling. It's not the freedom of choice. that's a good thing. Charlotte Mason actually talks a lot about freedom of choice. It's that ultimately, if you truly embrace the philosophy behind unschooling, you either believe there's no need to correct or be converted, or you believe you don't have the right to call the child to account
higher
or
standard.
to conversion. That is why Christians have to reject it, which is, I'm sure, a controversial thing to say, because I know there's Christian unschooling, but it is rooted in relativism, and the relativism is, well, you also can't be classical and unschooler, because at the end of the day, you have to have a leg to stand on when it comes to correction.
Well,
and
most
conversion.
people don't look into what the philosophy of unschooling is.
Or anything,
And
really.
because they grew up in a classroom, I think that some people use the word unschooling when they really mean they aren't doing a bunch of table work.
Again, we have a muddying of the non-essentials, because
What you can see is the difference instead of the
classroom
idea.
is a valid way to educate, but not the only way. And you could give a classical education in a classroom or outside of it, and it will look very different.
But
and
they're
yet
both straining for the ideal.
Exactly, they're chasing the same thing.
Yeah.
And so, which I will say too, I firmly believe there are classical schools that are not chasing the ideal. Which means, regardless of what they say or the curriculum they buy, they're not classical. This helps us keep something central.
Essential.
Yes, it does.
Non-essentials, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why you can find sweet little country schools that don't know anything about classical, and yet they're so good and wonderful. They're chasing the ideal. They just don't use the language, and they probably don't have a knowledge of the history, which means there is a way that they can embody the ideal more than they do. But because they believe in an ideal, because they believe in the Bible,
Yes.
they're actually able to pull off a wonderful education for their students.
Yeah. He says at the beginning of chapter 4, he talks about the immature mind participating in the mature. And so it's a part of that transformation that classical education is asking of a student, of a person. And that's what Rousseau undermines in saying that the child's natural state, or, the noble savage, that idea where being untampered with, uneducated is actually more virtuous or more, is just better. And classical and Christian thought understands that man isn't all he could and should be. And so you can always improve, and you should always be striving toward an ideal, striving towards an objective standard.
It's loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself, right? That is the what hangs, all the laws and the prophets, right? Like that is
The ideal.
the ideal. I loved his discussion on that early part of the chapter. Is the ideal type, right? It's an invitation to share in the struggle of self-knowledge and self-mastery. And great teachers exhibit an ideal in speech, behavior, and normative approach to learning. And those were some of the little bullet points that he talks about, which is a big task. It is a lifelong endeavor. Yeah.
Yeah, when our kids leave, we still have to deal with ourselves. I'm still here.
And then it goes on to say, like, their lessons spring to life in the moral climate around them. And I'm just thinking, atmosphere and life and discipline, right? Like the 3 Charlotte Mason tools. Like that's what I was thinking too, is it's all of it. It's all of it.
I think we could bring it back to where we started, which was page 38, and the idea of raising adults, not children. Now that we've had this discussion, I actually see the connection more, because by calling them to an ideal type, you're calling them, you said maturity. And I think that's when it clicked with me, Misty, was that you're calling that maturity is manhood. So you're calling them to adulthood when you're doing this. And then I was thinking about how, like, in the Bible, I feel like the ancient women had a hold of this, because they would give birth and they would say, behold, God gave me a man. They had the vision of the ideal type so ingrained in them that when they held their baby, they saw what he would be someday. And they called him to manhood from the second that he's born. And that's hard for me. I'm fine calling my teenage boys to manhood, but I think it was a real struggle for me, like 6 and under. I don't want to call my little baby sweetheart to a manhood. Like, I don't want him to be violent, and I don't want him to, like, all those things. I'm like, who's the meanest one of all? Which one of you is going to take this on? Because I'm like, really, like, talk to my younger self who wanted to protect my sons from manhood to some extent.
The Spartan women always talked about, well, we're the only ones who who birth men, right? Yeah. They're like, why are these Spartan women have so much freedom and they are so independent, and you know, other visiting cultures would come. She's like, because we're the only ones who raise men.
Which is a fascinating thing, that you gain your independence by raising real manhood, not by crushing manhood.
Yeah.
Huh.
Interesting.
Yeah.
They were pagans, but they got it. Because real men aren't threatened by independent women. Right? And independent women aren't threatened by real men. So it kind of goes back and forth.
Yes. Well, I mean, even in the little things with asking the boys to take out the garbage or that kind of thing, when it's kind of a little bit too big for them. Not because it's a stereotypical, this should be a man's job and kind of thing. Because I also had them do dishes. But because it's asking them to use their strength for something that's a bit too hard for them, and you let them struggle and figure it out and get stronger. When you ask them to do hard things that they can do through struggle, they become men. Yes. And you can start that when they're little.
Yep.
My mother-in-law tells a story that I guess I shocked her. So my oldest son was like 18 months, 2 years old or something. And we were at some relative's house, and he was tossing a ball back and forth in just an indoor game. It was not violent, but the ball rolled under some furniture or something. And I said, oh, you better go get it. And he had to like bend or whatever and figure out where it was and get it. And apparently this surprised my mother-in-law, because she would have just gotten it herself, like just bent over but I asked him to. So there was, in some ways, my laziness worked to my advantage.
Accidental success.
Yes, because I'm like, that was not on purpose. That was just because I'm not bending down.
It's your ball. Go get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Anytime we can give them real work, even if it isn't beyond their strength, right? Work is actually a great. Yeah, it's a great way to have your children grow up to be men, because men are called to work just as women are. It's different. And oftentimes most husbands will work outside of the home and have a job. Our kids always went with us in the barns. Yes, it was probably more work to have them with us at the time, but they could carry their little bucket of feed, and they could sit on the sheep while you're pulling a ewe out. And then guess what? Now they all know how to help pull lambs out of a ewe. Like, this is something, and they don't need any help, right? And when you give them real responsibility and they are really contributing, they feel that. Anytime we can do that. You know, and I think for people who don't live on farms and ranches like that, sports are also a great way. And I know there's a lot of people who don't want kids to get, so many concussions and all this stuff. So they just say no sports, or I don't want to drive because it's so much effort and things like that. And men need to be in an arena. like there is some of that, and not on a show, but like there is something that sports can do that really does speak to that maleness and that manhood and teamwork and camaraderie. And so this year I'm driving a whole lot more because we've got flag football and other things. So
I feel like even if you think I'm going to raise them in the country with animals so we don't have to do sports, then they're like, rodeo exists.
Yeah, where my kids really want to go to rodeo camp. Oh, which is a real thing.
That's awesome.
In Idaho.
Nice. Well, any parting thoughts as we close up our talk of the ideal, which I do believe we're going to swing back around to at least once next season, if we get our way.
Yes.
But with that said, any final things that you are going to be sad if we don't say them?
I thought this quote here kind of sums it up with the purpose and an emphasis on the practical of what we're doing as we educate them and give them the mythos and the history and all of that. It says the ideal type, lays claim to the student's will, capitalizing early on the student's youthful desire to grow up, to be a Regulus or a Cincinnatus, a Jefferson or a Lincoln. And it promises him a wealth of inner resources independent of outward circumstance, like those of the cabbage-eating farmers of the early Roman and American republics.
It's interesting he said the early American Republic, because a lot of people say George Washington was the American Cincinnati. That's a great quote. I think we should just end there.
Yes.
Great quote. All right. Well, thank you, guys. This was fun. Fun to record in person, too.
Well, I'm glad we chose Norms and Nobility episode to record together, because now I get to see your hardback copy, which you bragged about.
I feel like I should take a picture.
We will. I'm going to take a picture and put it on the show notes.
We could put it on Instagram,
yes,
too.
We can.
Yeah.
Proof that my book is real.
And really awesome. And it was only $20, and she always reminds us. Which, if you do not buy this book for this episode, we understand. We hope that you've enjoyed a portion of this wonderful book that not everyone, we understand, can afford.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend and then discuss it with them. This is a great way to continue the conversation. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scholesisters.com/SS113 to check it out. Don't forget to sign up for the Scholé Sistership and join us for the upcoming TechTonic seminar. Just go to scholesisters.com/join and become a Sophie member. In our next episode, Misty and I have a lovely chat with the one and only Rebecca Merkel. Misty and I both read Rebecca's book, Even Exile, and wanted to chat all things raising daughters, educating daughters, and launching daughters into a feminist world. It was a great discussion you won't want to miss. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
Telos.
Sure.
Outside of you, that you are not cut it off at standard.
Well,